Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the lecture on value, and hopefully this will be the last part. I think it'll just be a two-parter. So this is where we last left off. We were talking about this beautiful photograph by Sojimoto, and so onward to the next slide. So next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about value contrast. And so there are two main parts to value contrast. When we think about value contrast, we tend to mostly think about the value range as being the sole source of the contrast, but really there are two parts to the contrast because contrast is both an issue of what the range is, what is the lightest light, and what's the darkest dark, right? How far apart are they in value? But value range or value contrast is also an issue of the speed of contrast, how fast it goes from the light to the dark. I'll give you an example of this. Here are two photographs by Edward Weston, and they are different in the way they're using value contrast. You could say they're both pretty contrasty pieces, but the value range in the artichoke. I don't know why that's labeled pepper. That's my bad. On the artichoke photograph is a much higher range, right? The contrast, the lightest light, right? The value of how light that is to the absolute darkest dark, right? That range of value is much greater, right? It's a much wider range. But the photograph of the pepper feels like a very contrasty image because of the amount of dark, but more importantly because of how fast the image shifts from light to dark. The fact that the light is shining very strongly on the pepper and it's reflecting the light very strongly, and it has this very quick and fast shift from the light to the dark. So may not seem like an important point to all of you, but it's an important point to me. So remember, the value contrast is not just which one has the widest range. It's also an issue of the speed, the way that the light shifts from light to dark. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how images use value and value contrast. These two paintings are both good examples of artists using a very low contrast, low value contrast, and to a degree, in both cases, they have a kind of a similar effect, but a slightly different effect. Like obviously in the Monet, it helps to create a sense of mood and a sense of atmosphere of a specific moment in time, a specific light. It also, in both of these, helps to make our eye see color more clearly. The more you can limit the value contrast, the more clearly the human eye can then see small changes of temperature and of color. You can see that especially in the Malevich here. To give you an example, if we had like a strong black line painted around the white square within the white square, the black line was about an inch thick and it went all the way around and it was really, really dark black, then we would almost be impossible for our eyes to see the difference in color from this white to that white. But because the only contrast in the painting, there's a very faint, I think it's a graphite line, edge line there. But because there's so much more emphasis on just this really slight amount of value contrast, almost no value contrast whatsoever, we really strongly see the temperature change from the one to the other. I think also another difference is, like I said, in the Monet, the limited value contrast helps to create a sense of atmosphere and of mood, whereas in the Malevich, it helps to create a sense of austerity and a sense of purity of thought. And he's paring it down to just the absolute essential. And hold on a second. Also, value can be used as a way of creating emphasis. Here are two paintings that, in a way, almost create emphasis in the exact opposite way, right? Caravaggio uses an overall dark painting with a lot of atmospheric darks, and he's using a form of chiaroscuro called tenebrism, where the forms are revealed out of this real deep dark as just revealed by these kind of strong sideways lighting. And so the light reveals the form, and the contrast of value, right, in the areas where the light is shining strongly, creates emphasis and focus. and obviously the primary emphasis is right there on St. Matthew, who is receiving the call. And in this painting, it's the exact opposite, which is that the painting is this really subdued, very, very light range of value almost over the whole thing. Almost no value contrast whatsoever, these very, very faint washes. And then in just this small area, in the foreground where we have a little extra value contrast, it really kind of helps to create both space to pull that form forward, but also to create emphasis. And another thing that value can do in a composition is it can help to group shapes and to help organize the composition. We have looked at this painting so many times, many times, and talked about it so many different ways, and we'll continue to talk about it because it is an endlessly fascinating painting. But one of the ways to think about it is the way that, when we look at it, it's easy for us to see it first as just a collection of objects, a collection of figures, to think of it in terms of nameable things. But if you squint your eyes for a moment, let's go back just for a second. If you squint your eyes for a moment, and kind of pull away from the screen and really kind of squint at this image, what you'll start to see is that it really breaks down into light and dark shapes, and that the light shapes, let's say this shape here on this figure, and then to the light on that bandage, and then a light up to his arm, all of those light shapes kind of combine and start to become one larger light shape. And then the dark shapes, right, like this shadow shape, right, and here, whether it's on the figure or going onto the board, right, or the shadow shape of like the darker material, and then the shadows on the figure going into the shadows on the cloth behind them, all the darks start to unify and all the lights start to unify, and that is one of the primary ways that he's creating both unity and contrast, and he's creating both a sense of coherence, everything going together, but also a sense of dynamic action. So there we go. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about one last comparison, just looking at these three images and getting you to think about how each of them uses value differently. On the Whistler on the far left, right, the painting is primarily quite light, with a few areas of dark, and so the few areas of dark, especially her dark hair, really pull in as an area of contrast, right, and then therefore an area of focus. Our eye is drawn to that area of strong value contrast. But also the light values, and then having just this area of slightly darker values down here at the bottom, it creates this kind of push upward on a kind of floating up sort of feeling. It's a little bit I don't know, ethereal. And then comparing that to the Sargent, where it also is creating contrast by zooming in on an area of really, really strong contrast. But in this area, it's the area of her head and her neck and her shoulder, where we have this really, really strong amount of light, and then also a really strong amount of dark of the dress. So we have the greatest amount of value contrast in that area. And then if we look at the Richter, which kind of is different from both of the others because the range is not nearly as great as either one of them. None of the darks are quite as dark and none of the lights are quite as light, but there's also a lot more mid-value than both of them, but also because of this sort of photographic blur effect that he was starting to explore at this point, we also have this sense of really, really soft value contrast, or kind of slow gradations from value to value, which gives a very different kind of mood to the piece. Okay, that is the end of the lecture on value, and next we will be talking about composition and page structure.